The forest did not make noise that night. It breathed. That was the first thing anyone noticed when the wind died and the trees stood unnaturally still, as if they were listening. The air had a weight that pressed against the skin, the kind of weight that made a person feel watched even when nothing visible stirred. Somewhere deep inside those endless trees, a single echo rolled through the dark, low and hollow, like something large shifting just beneath the ground. People later argued about what that sound meant, but all of them remembered the unnerving stillness that followed, a stillness that felt older than the soil itself. Before the weekend began, the forest had been described as peaceful, untouched, a place where people went when they wanted quiet. But by the time the sun set on their first night, the forest felt like it had chosen its own purpose, and peace was no longer part of it. It waited, patient and cold, as if it understood something human beings did not. The first scream never carried far. The trees absorbed it like wet cloth absorbs blood, muffling it until it became little more than a tremor in the air. But inside that single sound was a truth that none of them were ready to face. Something had changed the moment they stepped beyond the tree line, a shift too subtle to explain and too heavy to ignore. They entered looking for rest, but rest did not welcome them. Something else did. Later, one survivor said that the forest did not feel abandoned or empty. It felt occupied, as though something unseen moved just out of sight, matching their footsteps with an intelligence that did not belong in the quiet. At first, they refused to believe it. They told themselves it was imagination, the mind reacting to silence, the way isolation could exaggerate simple shadows into threats. But shadows did not snap twigs deliberately. Shadows did not circle a campsite without disturbing anything else. Shadows did not observe. There was a moment near dusk when everything shifted. They stood near the creek, watching the surface of the water ripple unnaturally even though the air stood still. The current moved in strange circles, forming loops that looked far too intentional to be natural. One of them joked about it, then fell silent when he noticed no one else even smiled. They all stared at the water, silent, breath shallow, as if listening for something below the surface. The loops widened, then stopped all at once, leaving the water flat and reflective. Their own faces stared back at them, pale and uncertain, while the forest behind them looked darker than it had moments before. They left the creek without speaking. Something about the stillness felt wrong. Some people describe wilderness as peaceful because it offers solitude, but solitude only comforts the mind when it feels voluntary. Once it becomes forced, once the surrounding space feels occupied by something unseen, solitude becomes captivity. They sensed that shift long before they were willing to admit it. They felt the forest narrow around them. Paths that seemed clear earlier now felt covered in a thin film of unease. The air grew colder near certain trees for no reason. The smell of soil shifted from earthy to metallic. They tried to ignore it, but the forest did not let them. The first disappearance happened in silence. One person walked behind the group for only a moment, adjusting their backpack, blinking slowly because the hike had tired them. They were there one breath, the next gone. No footsteps running off. No sound of struggle, just absence. The other stood frozen, staring at the empty spot where moments ago there had been a living, breathing person. They called out, expecting an answer, but the forest returned nothing. No echo, no rustle, no reassurance, only silence thick enough to feel, sliding down the back of their necks like a cold hand. They searched, voices trembling, forcing themselves deeper between the trees until their calls blended into the quiet. They told themselves the missing person must have wandered off the trail, that fear was exaggerating everything, but explanations felt like lies, thin and fragile. They found no broken branches, no footprints, no trail of movement at all. The forest held no clues. It was as if the ground swallowed the person whole without leaving a mark. By the time night arrived, their fear was no longer subtle. The fire they built burned high, but the darkness beyond its glow stayed dense, like a wall pressing inward. Every crackle of flame felt like a warning. Every shift of shadow looked deliberate. They huddled together, whispering about strange shapes they thought they had seen, shapes that did not move like any animal. One person said they felt something watching them through the trees, something tall and motionless. Another said they heard breathing that did not sound human. The rest refused to respond, not because they disagreed, but because the truth weighed too heavily. There is a moment in every terrifying experience when a person senses a boundary has been crossed, when danger is no longer potential but certain. That moment arrived for them long before dawn. The forest around them felt alive in a way that defied understanding, not alive like wildlife or nature, alive like awareness. Something had decided they did not belong there, and the weekend they planned for peace had already turned into something else entirely. Something they would never be able to explain without trembling. And long after authorities arrived, long after search teams scanned every inch of soil, one question still hung cold in the air, unanswered and quietly horrifying. What if the forest never intended to let them leave at all? The forest had always existed on the edge of local memory, a place that people rarely entered without purpose. It bordered a quiet rural community where stories flowed more freely than facts and where old warnings lingered in the whispered habits of families who lived close to the tree line. There were tales about strange echoes, stories about missing hikers, murmurs about shapes seen at dusk, but none of these had ever been enough to keep determined visitors away. The forest had a strange beauty that tempted people, a kind of quiet that felt like a promise. Those who lived closest to it often said the silence could soothe a restless mind, but those same people advised never to go too deep and never to stay after sundown. Outsiders dismissed these warnings as superstition. Those who lived near the forest treated them as survival. The group who entered that weekend did not know any of this. They came with the hope of rest, believing that stepping away from crowded streets and constant noise would ease the heavy weight they carried in their lives. They wanted a peaceful weekend, a break from work, stress, and everything that pressed against their shoulders. They packed lightly, expecting nothing more than quiet trails, fresh air, and stars filling the sky. They chose the forest not because it was famous or comfortable, but because it was isolated. They believed isolation would heal them. Instead, it unmade them. The weather had shifted quickly in the days leading up to their arrival. Locals spoke about unusual winds that rattled windows even when the sky remained clear, and about the animals that began moving closer to the roads as if they wanted to escape the dense darkness inside the forest. Birds avoided the tallest trees. Deer stood near the far edges of fields, their ears twitching at sounds no one else heard. A farmer who lived nearest the forest said the silence reminded him of the moments before a storm that never comes. He described it as tension without release, pressure without explanation. When the group drove past his property, he watched their car disappear behind the curve of the road and muttered that the forest always took notice when outsiders arrived. No one in the group noticed anything unusual at first. The path seemed ordinary, the air pleasant, the trees thick but inviting. They joked, they took photos, they admired the scenery in a way that suggested they believed nothing could go wrong. They did not feel the shift that older eyes might have sensed. They did not see how the trees quieted when they passed, or how the trees leaned just slightly inward, narrowing the path without seeming to move. They did not feel the heavy tension beneath the soil that locals swore carried old regrets, old memories, and older dangers. The deeper they walked, the more the forest changed, not in dramatic ways but in subtle details that felt easy to ignore. The air cooled even though the sun remained high. The smell of pine thickened, sharp and slightly metallic. There were faint indentations in the soil that did not resemble typical animal tracks, long and narrow, as if something dragged itself rather than walked. Still, none of these observations felt threatening enough to turn back. They called it wilderness, nature, the kind of unpredictability that comes with remote places. But the forest knew they noticed, and noticing was always the first mistake. Long before their arrival, there had been stories about travelers who went too deep and returned changed, quiet, and unwilling to speak about what they saw. Some said the forest altered people, bending their sense of direction until they did not know where they were. Others believed the forest held a presence that did not like to be observed. There were accounts of search teams reporting strange shapes moving between trees, shapes that did not match any known animal. There were descriptions of faint voices heard far past midnight, voices that repeated the same words in tones that did not sound entirely human. But every story ended the same way, unresolved and forgotten by everyone who lived closest to the forest. The group had no knowledge of these warnings. They only saw a landscape untouched by crowds. They did not realize they were stepping into a place that others respected through fear rather than admiration. The forest did not welcome them. It tolerated them with a slow. Their first morning in the forest began with a quiet that felt comforting for only a few minutes. The sun rose slowly, casting pale ribbons of light between the branches. Yet the forest floor remained strangely dim, as if the light struggled to reach it. The group moved through the trees with growing unease, sensing something different about the air. It felt thicker, heavier, and somehow more watchful than the day before. When they walked, they noticed the crunch of leaves did not echo the way it should have. The sound felt muted, as if they were moving inside a room padded with something soft and absorbing. The forest felt close, almost pressed against them. And even though no one said it aloud, each of them sensed that something had shifted overnight. One of them noticed the first sign, a small shape perched high on a branch, completely still, facing the group, even though it had no visible eyes. It blended with the bark in a way that made it difficult to separate from the tree. They stared at it for several seconds, trying to understand what it was, but the longer they looked, the more it seemed to merge with the surrounding shadows. When they blinked, it appeared to tilt, as if adjusting its focus. They stepped back slowly, confusion spreading across their faces. When they looked again, the shape was gone, not moved, not fled, simply gone without a trace, as if the branch never held anything at all. Throughout the hike, strange details collected around them the way dust gathers on forgotten shelves. A fallen log that had deep scratches along its length, too regular to be animal marks. A pile of stones arranged in a near-perfect circle, cold to the touch despite the steady warmth of the sun. A whisper of movement deeper inside the brush, too deliberate to be wind. The group told themselves the forest was old, that oddities were natural in isolated places. But each detail pulled their nerves tighter, until even the smallest sound made them turn sharply, eyes wide. By midday, the wind returned, but it moved in an unnatural pattern. It came in long waves, slow and rhythmic, almost like measured breathing. When the wind shifted through the branches, it created a faint hum that felt deliberate, like something signaling from far away. They stopped multiple times, listening, trying to determine the direction of the sound, but it shifted unpredictably, circling them in wide arcs. There were moments when it seemed to form a single repeated tone that stretched across the tree line, a tone that felt too hollow to be natural. One person whispered that the forest was speaking. No one responded. They tried to convince themselves that nothing was wrong, but the forest answered that hope with quiet cruelty. The narrow path they followed dissolved without warning, fading into soft soil that carried no recognizable markers. The trees looked identical in every direction, tall and dark, leaning inward just slightly, as if guarding something at the center. Anxiety crept through them, and more than once they pulled out their map
only to realize it no longer matched the terrain around them. Trails that should have existed seemed erased. Landmarks noted on the map did not appear anywhere near where they stood. It felt as though the forest had shifted overnight, rearranging itself with purpose. When they decided to turn back, they walked for nearly an hour before realizing they had circled back to the same clearing where they started. The wind remained still around the clearing, and the silence pressed so tightly against their ears that they felt dizzy. In the center of the clearing sat an object that none of them remembered seeing earlier. A small wooden carving shaped vaguely like a human figure, but distorted, with limbs too long and a hollow cavity where the chest should have been. It sat upright, perfectly balanced despite the uneven ground beneath it. They approached it cautiously, feeling the air around it pulse with coldness. The closer they came, the more they sensed a faint smell of damp earth and iron. One of them reached out to touch it before the others could stop them. The moment their fingers brushed the wood, the forest reacted. Branches creaked, leaves rustled in a sudden sweep, though there was no wind. A deep, groaning sound rolled beneath the ground, like something buried shifting its weight. The person jerked their hand back, pale, insisting that the carving felt warm, almost alive. They backed away slowly, their breath unsteady, their eyes fixed on the distorted figure. None of them wanted to remain near it, yet none of them could deny that the carving felt like a warning. Tension thickened as the afternoon faded. They walked faster, hoping to escape whatever invisible presence moved with them. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching across the forest floor in thin, grasping lines. The sun dipped, and with every degree it lowered, the forest darkened faster than it should have. The air cooled as if the forest exhaled. That was when the noises began again. Slow, steady steps that matched their pace from somewhere behind them. They stopped. The footsteps stopped. They moved. The footsteps followed. They turned, searching for the source, but the trees revealed nothing except darkness swallowing the space between them. Panic built, subtle but undeniable, like a hand tightening slowly around a throat. By the time they reached their campsite, night had already claimed the forest, and each of them carried a fear they could no longer hide. Something in the forest had chosen to reveal itself, not fully, not directly, but enough for them to understand one truth clearly. They were no longer wandering the forest. The forest was circling them. When daylight returned, it did not feel like a promise. It felt like a thin boundary between them and something waiting beyond the edges of their vision. The fire had burned low overnight, but none of them remembered letting it fade. Each person insisted they stayed awake longer than the others, certain that sleep never claimed them. Yet all of them awoke with the same sensation. The forest had watched them through every hour of the night. The ground around their campsite confirmed that feeling. The soil was disturbed, patterned with faint impressions that resembled footprints, but followed no recognizable shape. They were neither human nor animal, long and narrow, with shallow dips marked across the center, almost like ribbed indentations. The prints circled their camp twice before disappearing into the darkest part of the trees, leaving behind a trail that seemed intentional, almost guiding. They searched for more evidence without speaking, unsure if words would invite something closer. The forest felt hostile in a quiet way, as if its silence held command over them. They found torn bark strips hanging from several trees near the camp, peeled away in long vertical patterns. Each strip had smooth edges, as though removed with deliberate precision. The exposed wood beneath carried faint indentations resembling fingerprints, but they were far too long to belong to any person. A few of them touched the marks carefully, whispering that the wood felt warm, even though the morning air remained cool. The warmth unsettled them more than the marks themselves. One of them found a deeper clue near the path they followed the day before. A shallow hole had been dug near a cluster of roots, revealing an object wrapped in damp cloth. When they pulled it free, the cloth tore easily, exposing a wooden carving similar to the one they found in the clearing. This one, however, had a different shape. The limbs were bent backward, folded in unnatural angles, and the face had no features except a single carved line that spiraled downward like a cut. The figure was heavier than expected, as if something swollen had formed inside it. They held it for only a moment before placing it back on the ground, disturbed by the faint sound that echoed inside the hollow figure when they moved it. It resembled a slow inhale, long and strained. As they searched further, inconsistencies multiplied. The trail leading away from the campsite should have shown their footprints from the previous.
Fear had a way of shifting from a reaction into a presence, and by the time the group reached the next morning, fear moved among them like a silent companion. None of them spoke without glancing toward the trees first, as if they expected the forest to react to every word they released into the air. Their voices were soft, their sentences clipped, their breathing shallow. The night had not given them rest. It had only deepened the questions that clawed at their minds. Each person felt the same pressure behind their ribs, a heaviness that did not belong to exhaustion alone. They carried the sense that something had brushed against their thoughts while they slept, something that reached just close enough to make them doubt their own memories. They tried to recall each moment clearly, but details slipped away like water from cupped hands. They were certain they spoke to one another in the night, yet no one remembered what they said. They recalled the faint sound of footsteps or whispers, but no one could agree whether those sounds came from inside the camp or outside it. Their minds felt scraped raw, as if worn down by something attempting to understand them from within. The emotional weight of the situation grew heavier as the day lengthened. They felt guilt for the missing member, an unspoken shame that none of them could express directly. Each person believed they could have done more to stop the disappearance, even though logic insisted otherwise. They avoided looking at the spot where the person vanished, but their eyes always drifted there, drawn by the same magnetic dread that made them unable to stop imagining the moment again and again. They pictured the empty space, the soundless removal, the absence that felt too clean. Trauma settled in their bodies as a quiet tremor, subtle but constant, an echo of the realization that the world they believed they understood had shifted beneath their feet. Their thoughts became unreliable, and the forest amplified every fear until it felt real. When someone stepped a few feet away from the group, they felt a cold panic surge through their chest. When a branch snapped in the distance, hearts hammered, eyes darted, breaths caught. They flinched when leaves rustled, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The forest no longer felt like a collection of trees. It felt like a vast, watching body, with every branch acting as a limb and every shadow acting as an eye. They sensed the forest pressing closer, not physically, but psychologically. It circled their thoughts the way it circled their camp.
Each footstep seemed to reverberate too loudly. Each breath felt like it carried a consequence. Something else began to haunt them, something even more unsettling than their growing dread. A silent question burrowed into their thoughts. Why had the forest chosen them? They had come with peaceful intentions, seeking rest and calm, but the forest responded with hostility and observation. This contradiction made them doubt themselves. Doubt grew into self-blame. Self-blame hardened into quiet despair. They felt as though they had trespassed into a place that did not desire visitors, and the punishment for their intrusion unfolded slowly, stripping away their stability, 1 hour at a time. They whispered apologies into the air, without knowing whom they addressed. Some apologized to the missing member. Others apologized to the forest itself. The emotional deterioration deepened when they attempted to track the remaining paths out of the area. Each effort led them back to the same clearing or the same cluster of trees. The forest manipulated direction in a way that felt deliberate, as if shifting the landscape only when they moved, guiding them in circles that grew tighter and more suffocating. The realization that they were trapped created a suffocating dread. Panic no longer surged in bursts. It settled as a steady pressure behind their lungs. Their thoughts spun into darker corners. Their hopes dissolved into silence. They began seeing movement that did not appear entirely external. Flickers of long limbs slipping between trees. Shadows bending in ways that contradicted natural light. Shapes standing still at the edge of their vision, vanishing the moment they looked directly. Whether these were real or the manifestation of terrified minds, none of them could say. The boundary between hallucination and reality blurred until each person doubted their own senses. Fear had become a filter through which they viewed everything. Their minds filled in dangers even where none existed, yet they also failed to recognize genuine threats because everything felt threatening. The emotional toll pulled them apart internally, but forced them to cling to one another physically, like people desperate to remain awake in a place that thrived on disorientation. They whispered reassurance, but their voices lacked conviction. They repeated logical explanations, but logic felt fragile. They watched each other unravel. Shoulders slumped, eyes darkened, hands trembled. The forest seemed to feed on this unraveling, tightening its grip, until the group felt like prey being gradually exhausted rather than hunted directly. Families and friends far from the forest would later describe the aftermath in their own emotional terms. Some lost sleep for months, imagining the terror their loved ones experienced. Others refused to believe the official explanations and carried guilt for not warning them against traveling. The community nearest to the forest fell into a quiet fear of its own, whispering to one another that the place had awakened again, that something inside it had grown restless after years of silence, and that the group had stumbled into a space that should not have been entered. Emotional shockwaves spread far beyond the forest's edge, carried by grief, confusion, and disbelief. The emotional scars left on the survivors were not visible, but they ran deep. Their eyes carried the memory of something that observed them with an intelligence they could not understand. Something that filled their minds with dread that felt beyond instinct. Something that watched without needing to move. The survivors spoke few words, but each one carried weight, and none of them answered the question that haunted everyone who learned of their story. What exactly followed them in that forest? And why did it feel so human while remaining nothing like one? When authorities finally entered the forest, they did so with an unease they could not explain, as if every officer sensed something wrong before taking even a single step past the tree line. Their radios crackled strangely, producing faint static patterns that did not match interference or malfunction. A few claimed they heard whispers between the static, although none admitted this in their official reports. From the beginning, the investigation felt distorted. Paths shifted under their feet the same way they had for the survivors. Trees leaned at odd angles that seemed to change subtly over time. Search teams moved slowly, constrained not just by caution, but by an instinctive fear they struggled to rationalize. The missing person remained unaccounted for, and the deeper the investigators searched, the less certainty they had about what happened inside those trees. The first theory proposed was the simplest: a human threat. Some investigators believed a person, or several, lived deep inside the forest, avoiding detection while honing their knowledge of the terrain. They suggested that someone could carve the figurines, erase footprints, and track the group silently. This theory gained temporary traction because it offered a reason grounded in human capability. Investigators searched for campsites, shelters, or signs of habitation, but the forest offered nothing. No ash from fires, no hidden shelters, no tools, no remnants of food. The soil showed no trails that resembled consistent human travel. Even trained trackers said the forest felt untouched in unnatural ways, as if every movement had been smoothed out deliberately. Eventually, the human threat theory weakened, yet no one fully dismissed it. People preferred believing in a hidden person more than they wished to consider anything else. The second theory focused on psychological breakdown. Some experts suggested that the isolation and silence of the forest created a shared delusion among the group. They claimed the carvings were natural phenomena, misinterpreted by frightened minds. They argued the footprints were animal tracks distorted by soft soil and poor lighting. They insisted the forest did not shift, but the group's fear did. According to these experts, panic spread like contagion, twisting small details into overwhelming threats. This theory comforted the public, but created anger among those who survived. The survivors insisted they knew what hallucination felt like, and what they saw did not resemble hallucinations. Their voices carried unshakable conviction. They refused to alter their testimonies, no matter how much pressure mounted to